Sometimes, the bonds between man and animal run deeper than we can ever understand. For Apache warrior Angus, his wolf companion Kanti had always been more than just a hunting partner. The wolf was family, a connection to the ancient ways of his people. But now Kanti was acting strange, staring at a forbidden cave day and night with eyes full of fear and knowing. The tribal elders had always warned against this place, speaking of curses and buried secrets. When an eerie glow began pulsing from the cave's opening, visible even in daylight but growing stronger each night, Angus knew something was awakening. Kanti's behavior became more troubled as the mysterious light intensified. What had been sleeping in that cave for generations, and why was it stirring now? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The desert wind carried whispers of ancient stories across the vast expanse of Arizona territory, where the red rocks stood like silent sentinels against an endless sky. In this unforgiving land, where survival demanded both strength and wisdom, Angus Walking Bear had made his home among his people for 47 years. His weathered hands spoke of countless hunts. His keen eyes reflected the patience of a man who understood the rhythms of the earth. And his heart carried the weight of traditions passed down through generations. At his side, as always, padded Kanti, a magnificent gray wolf whose amber eyes held an intelligence that sometimes unsettled even Angus. The wolf had come into his life 8 years ago as an orphan pup, found whimpering beside his mother's lifeless body after a particularly harsh winter storm. Most of the tribe had advised against keeping the wild creature, but something in those desperate amber eyes had spoken to Angus's soul. Perhaps it was the loneliness he recognized there, or maybe the fierce determination to survive against impossible odds. Whatever the reason, he had wrapped the tiny pup in his warmest blanket and carried him home. Now, Kanti stood nearly as tall as a man's waist, his powerful frame rippling with muscle beneath his thick coat. The wolf had never been tamed. That wasn't the Apache way. Instead, he had chosen to stay, forming a bond with Angus that transcended the typical relationship between human and animal. They hunted together, traveled together, and understood each other in ways that needed no words. Kanti's senses were Angus's early warning system, while Angus's wisdom guided them both through the countless dangers of desert life. The tribal settlement lay nestled in a valley protected by towering red cliffs, where ancient cottonwoods provided shade, and a small spring offered precious water year-round. Adobe dwellings dotted the landscape, their earthy walls blending seamlessly with the natural surroundings. Smoke rose from cooking fires as women prepared the evening meal, while children played games that had been passed down for centuries. The air carried the scent of sage, juniper, and the faint sweetness of prickly pear blossoms. Angus's own dwelling sat slightly apart from the others, reflecting his role as one of the tribe's primary scouts and hunters. Inside, the walls were adorned with hunting trophies, handmade weapons, and sacred items inherited from his grandfather. Among these treasures was an ancient wolf pendant carved from turquoise, its surface worn smooth by generations of handling. The pendant had belonged to his great-grandfather, a medicine man known for his ability to communicate with animal spirits. Angus wore it always, feeling its familiar weight against his chest like a protective talisman. For the past week, however, that familiar weight had begun to feel different. The turquoise pendant had started growing warm against his skin, particularly when he and Kanti ventured near the northern edge of their territory. At first, he had dismissed it as his imagination, but the sensation had become impossible to ignore. The pendant pulsed with a gentle heat that seemed to match the rhythm of his heartbeat, growing stronger as they approached a particular area of the desert that had always made him uneasy. That area centered around a cave that his people had avoided for as long as anyone could remember. The elders' stories spoke of it in hushed tones, calling it a place where the veil between worlds grew thin. It was said to be a burial ground for ancient ones, a sacred space where powerful medicine had been worked long before the current generation had been born. The tribal council had declared it forbidden territory, warning that those who disturbed the site would bring misfortune not only upon themselves, but upon the entire community. Despite these warnings, or perhaps because of them, Angus had always been aware of the cave's presence. He had glimpsed it from a distance during hunting expeditions, a dark opening in the face of a red sandstone cliff, partially hidden by scrub brush and fallen rocks. Nothing about it seemed particularly remarkable, yet something had always made him turn away before getting too close. It was the same instinct that warned him away from rattlesnakes or approaching storms, a deep-seated knowledge that certain things were best left alone. But Kanti's recent behavior had changed everything. The wolf had begun displaying an obsessive fascination with the forbidden area, sitting for hours at the edge of their territory and staring northward with an intensity that troubled Angus deeply. At first, the behavior had been subtle or reluctance to leave that particular spot during their daily rounds, an unusual alertness when the wind blew from the north. But as the days passed, Kanti's fixation had grown more pronounced and disturbing. The wolf would pace restlessly around their dwelling, at night, whining softly and pawing at the door as if desperate to venture north in the darkness. During the day, he would lead Angus on increasingly frequent trips to the boundary of their territory, always stopping at the same spot, a low ridge that offered a clear view of the distant cave. There, Kanti would sit motionless for hours, his amber eyes fixed on that dark opening with an unwavering focus that seemed almost supernatural. Angus had tried everything to break the wolf's strange vigil. He had offered food, initiated games, even attempted to lead Kanti in the opposite direction for extended hunts. But the wolf's attention always returned to the cave, as if drawn by some invisible force. Most troubling of all, Kanti had begun to refuse food, his magnificent frame growing noticeably thinner as his obsession consumed him. The situation had not gone unnoticed by the other members of the tribe. Ayana Crowfeather, the elderly medicine woman who served as keeper of the old stories, had approached Angus 3 days ago with concern etched deeply into her weathered features. She was a woman of 73 winters, her long white hair braided with sacred beads and her dark eyes still sharp with intelligence despite her age. Around her neck hung a leather medicine pouch that had belonged to her grandmother, filled with herbs and stones that were said to react to spiritual disturbances. "The wolf senses something stirring," she had told Angus, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent interpreting signs and omens. "My medicine pouch has been warm for days now, and my dreams are filled with shadows. Something long buried is awakening, and your Kanti feels its call." Ayana's words had sent a chill down Angus's spine, not because he doubted her wisdom, but because they confirmed his own growing fears. The turquoise pendant had been growing warmer each day, and he too had been experiencing strange dreams, fragmented visions of ancient ceremonies and desperate warnings that he could never quite remember upon waking. The tribal council had held emergency meetings to discuss the situation, their faces grave as they debated the meaning of these troubling signs. Some advocated for moving the entire settlement away from the area until whatever was happening had run its course. Others argued for sending scouts to investigate the source of the disturbance. But the majority agreed with Ayana's assessment that the forbidden cave was somehow involved, and that approaching it would only invite disaster. As the sun began to set on another day of Kanti's vigil, Angus stood at the edge of their territory and watched his companion's unwavering stare. The wolf hadn't moved in 3 hours, his powerful frame rigid with attention as he focused on something that only he could sense. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the desert, and for a moment, Angus thought he saw something else, a faint glimmer of light emanating from the area around the cave. He blinked, and looked again, certain his eyes were playing tricks on him. But the glimmer persisted, a subtle luminescence that seemed to pulse gently against the darkening sky. It was barely visible in the daylight, no brighter than the reflection of sunlight on water, but it was definitely there. As he watched, transfixed, the light seemed to grow slightly stronger, as if responding to his attention. Kanti let out a low whine, the first sound he had made all day. The wolf's ears were pinned back against his head, and his tail was tucked low, signs of distress that Angus had rarely seen in his normally confident companion. Whatever was happening at that cave, it was affecting Kanti on a level that went beyond normal animal instincts. Angus felt the turquoise pendant pulse against his chest, its warmth now unmistakable. The ancient carved wolf seemed to throb with its own heartbeat, matching the rhythm of the distant light. For a moment, he thought he heard something, a whisper, carried on the wind, words in a language he didn't recognize but somehow understood. They spoke of awakening, of ancient bonds, and of a choice that would soon have to be made as darkness fell across the desert. The mysterious light grew more pronounced, casting an eerie glow against the sandstone cliffs. Kanti remained at his vigil, but now his whining had taken on a more urgent tone. The wolf looked back at Angus with eyes that seemed to plead for understanding, as if trying to communicate something vital that human words could never express. Standing there in the gathering darkness, with the weight of generations of warnings pressing down upon him and the desperate need in his companion's eyes, Angus realized that their lives were about to change forever. Whatever ancient force was stirring in that forbidden cave, it had chosen them as its focal point. The question was no longer whether they would become involved, but how they would respond when the time came to make that choice. The desert wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and something else, something older and more mysterious. As Angus placed a comforting hand on Kanti's head, he felt the wolf's muscles tense beneath his touch. The light from the cave pulsed once more, brighter than before, and both man and wolf knew that tomorrow would bring answers they might not. Be prepared to face. Dawn broke with an ominous stillness that set Angus's nerves on edge. The usual chorus of desert birds was absent, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed to press against his eardrums. He emerged from his dwelling to find Kanti collapsed beside the doorway, the wolf's powerful frame trembling with exhaustion. For the first time in 8 years, his companion had abandoned his vigilant watch. Angus knelt beside the wolf, running his hands through the thick gray coat that now felt dry and brittle to the touch. Kanti's breathing was shallow, his amber eyes unfocused and distant. The wolf had pushed himself beyond his physical limits, driven by whatever supernatural force emanated from the forbidden cave. As Angus cradled his companion's head, he felt the turquoise pendant burn against his chest with an intensity that made him gasp. Old friend. He whispered, his voice thick with concern. What burden are you carrying? Kanti's eyes slowly focused on Angus's face, and in their depths, he saw something that chilled him to the bone. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was fear. In all their years together, through encounters with bears, mountain lions, and hostile raiders, he had never seen fear in those amber eyes. Whatever waited in that cave had the power to terrify a creature that knew no natural predator. As the sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Angus noticed other disturbing changes. The small animals that usually scurried through their territory were nowhere to be seen. Even the ever-present lizards that basked on the sun-warmed rocks had vanished. The very air felt charged with an energy that made his skin crawl and set his teeth on edge. By midday, the mysterious light from the cave had become visible even in the bright sunlight, no longer the subtle glimmer he had first observed. It pulsed with a rhythm that seemed to match his heartbeat, casting an unnatural luminescence against the red sandstone cliffs. The sight drew him north, despite every instinct screaming at him to turn away. The turquoise pendant had grown so hot against his skin that he finally removed it, holding the ancient carving in his palm. The moment his fingers closed around it, visions flooded his mind, flashes of ancient ceremonies, desperate faces painted with sacred symbols, and something dark and powerful being bound with chains of light. The images came so fast and intense that he staggered, pressing his free hand against a nearby boulder for support. When the vision subsided, Angus found himself staring at something that hadn't been there moments before. Half buried in the sandy soil near his feet was an obsidian arrowhead, its surface gleaming with the same pulsing light that emanated from the distant cave. The weapon was beautifully crafted, its edges sharp enough to cut the wind itself, but it radiated an energy that made his fingers tingle when he picked it up. The moment the obsidian touched his skin, the arrowhead began to pulse in perfect synchronization with the cave's light. Strange symbols appeared along its surface, ancient markings that shifted and changed like living things. Though he had never seen these symbols before, their meaning seemed to flow directly into his consciousness. They spoke of binding and release, of guardians and prisoners, of a choice that would determine the fate of more than just his tribe. Thunder rumbled across the cloudless sky, and the desert wind picked up with sudden violence. Dust devils danced across the landscape like ghostly spirits, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in a matter of minutes. The supernatural storm centered on the Forbidden's cave, where the mysterious light now blazed with an intensity that hurt to look at. Directly, Kanti struggled to his feet, his exhaustion temporarily forgotten in the face of this new development. The wolf's hackles rose as he stared toward the cave, a low growl rumbling in his throat. But this wasn't the aggressive sound he made when facing a threat. It was something deeper, more primal. It was the sound of recognition. As the unnatural storm raged around them, Angus became aware of movement in his peripheral vision. Dark shapes flitted between the rocks and scrub brush, too quick and elusive to focus on directly. They moved like shadows given form, darting from one hiding place to another in a pattern that suggested intelligence and purpose. Each time he turned to look directly at one of these shadow figures, it would vanish, only to reappear somewhere else moments later. The obsidian arrowhead grew warm in his hand, and suddenly he could see them clearly. The shadow figures were humanoid in shape, but composed of pure darkness, their forms constantly shifting and writhing as if barely able to maintain cohesion in the physical world. They moved with predatory grace, circling the settlement like wolves preparing for an attack. But their attention wasn't focused on the tribal dwellings. They were all moving toward the cave, drawn by the same force that had been affecting Kanti. Angus realized with growing horror that whatever was happening wasn't confined to his immediate area. Looking toward the settlement, he could see other animals behaving strangely. Horses reared and whinnied in terror. Dogs howled in harmonious distress. And even the cattle had clustered together in tight defensive formations. The shadow figures passed among them like smoke, invisible to eyes that weren't aided by the obsidian arrowhead's supernatural sight. By the time the storm began to subside, a crowd had gathered at the settlement's northern edge. Tribal members pointed and spoke in hushed, frightened voices as they observed the blazing light that continued to pour from the Forbidden's cave. Some of the elders were already preparing to flee, loading essential belongings onto horses and arguing about which direction would take them farthest from the disturbance. Ayanna Crowfeather approached Angus through the gathering crowd, her medicine pouch clutched tightly in her weathered hands. The leather bag was glowing with a soft blue light, and the sacred herbs within rustled and shifted as if alive. Her dark eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and terrible understanding. "The binding is failing," she said, her voice barely audible, above the wind. "My grandfather told me stories, warnings passed down through the generations. He said this day would come, when the ancient seals would weaken and the imprisoned ones would stir." She gestured toward the cave with a trembling hand. That light isn't evil, Angus. It's the guardian spirit calling for help. The real danger lies in what it's trying to keep contained. As if summoned by her words, the shadow figures became more aggressive in their movements. They no longer attempted to hide, but moved openly across the landscape, their forms growing more solid and defined with each passing moment. Some of the tribal members gasped in terror as the creatures became visible to normal sight, dark shapes that seemed to absorb light itself. Kanti let out a howl that echoed across the desert, a sound unlike anything Angus had ever heard from his companion. It was answered by other howls from the distant wild wolves, responding to a call that transcended the normal boundaries between species. The obsidian arrowhead pulsed brighter in Angus's hand, and suddenly he understood. Kanti wasn't just his companion. The wolf was descended from the spirit, animals that had helped create the original binding centuries ago. The tribal council convened an emergency meeting as the sun reached its zenith, their faces grim as they debated their options. Some advocated immediate evacuation, arguing that their ancestors had forbidden the area for good reason. Others insisted that running would only delay the inevitable if the ancient seals were truly failing. The darkness would eventually spread far beyond their current territory. Angus found himself caught between two worlds of understanding. His rational mind agreed with those who wanted to flee, recognizing the wisdom in avoiding forces beyond their comprehension. But the obsidian arrowhead in his hand told a different story, whispering of duty and destiny, of choices that couldn't be avoided no matter how far they ran. As the debate raged around him, he made a decision that would change everything. Rather than wait for the council to reach a consensus, he would investigate the cave himself. The guardian spirit was calling for help, and the shadow creatures were growing stronger with each passing hour. If there was a chance to prevent disaster, he had to take it, not just for his tribe, but for all the innocent lives that would be lost if the ancient evil escaped its prison. Kanti seemed to sense his resolve, the wolf's amber eyes meeting his with an understanding that needed no words. Together, they would face whatever waited in that forbidden cave, carrying with them the weight of their ancestors' warnings and the hope that wisdom and courage might yet prevail against the gathering darkness. Angus spent the rest of the day gathering information from the tribal elders, each conversation revealing fragments of a larger, more terrifying picture. The oldest members of the community remembered stories their great-grandparents had whispered around dying fires, tales of ancient battles between light and darkness, of powerful shamans who had sacrificed everything to contain an evil that threatened to consume the world. Maria Stonecrow, nearly 90, and the keeper of the oldest oral traditions, shared the most disturbing account. Her voice trembled as she spoke of memories passed down through 5 generations. My great-grandmother was just a child when the last awakening occurred, more than a century ago. She saw the shadow creatures emerge from hidden places across the desert, drawn by a weakening in the spiritual barriers that kept them imprisoned. The old woman's weathered hands shook as she described scenes that had haunted her family's dreams. For decades, 7 tribes came together then, bringing their most powerful medicine men. The ceremony lasted 3 days and 3 nights, and when it was over, half the shamans were dead. Their life force had been consumed by the binding ritual, but their sacrifice bought us peace for many generations. Maria reached into a hidden pouch and withdrew a small fragment of carved bone. This belonged to one of those shamans, my great-grandmother's uncle. He told her before he died that the guardian spirit grows weak with each passing century. When the last ember of its power dies, the ancient evil will be free to walk the earth again, and this time there may be no one left with enough knowledge to stop it. As Angus absorbed these revelations, commotion arose at the settlement's edge. A stranger rode into their territory, a man of mixed Apache and European heritage, who introduced himself as Thomas Redstone. He was an archaeologist from the Territorial University, but his approach showed deep respect for tribal customs. Thomas dismounted his horse and waited patiently at the settlement's boundary until formally invited to enter, demonstrating knowledge of proper protocols that immediately earned him cautious acceptance. "I've been mapping electromagnetic anomalies across the Southwest using new scientific instruments," Thomas explained to the hastily assembled council. His equipment filled several pack animals' strange metal devices with coils and wires that hummed with barely audible energy. "My readings have detected a network of underground cavern systems connected by what can only be described as natural electromagnetic conduits. The patterns suggest these formations are far older than any known civilization in this area." Thomas spread hand-drawn maps across the ground, their surfaces covered with complex symbols and mathematical calculations. The energy signatures form precise geometric patterns that span hundreds of miles. Ancient peoples somehow tapped into these natural power sources, creating a continental network that my instruments can detect but not fully explain. Ayanna examined the strange instruments with obvious fascination, her weathered fingers tracing the metal surfaces while her medicine pouch grew warm against her chest. "Your metal eyes see what our spirits have always known," she said, with a mixture of respect and concern. "The earth itself remembers the ancient binding. These energy paths you speak of, we call them the spirit roads, paths that connect sacred places across the land." Over the following days, Kanti began leading Angus to other locations where similar phenomena were occurring. The wolf's behavior was unlike anything Angus had ever observed. Kanti moved with supernatural purpose, following scent trails that no normal animal could detect. At each site the wolf led them to, they found evidence of ancient habitation that predated known tribal history. The first location was a hidden valley, where the ground hummed with energy that made their skin tingle. Ancient pottery shards littered the area, their surfaces decorated with symbols identical to those they had seen around the cave. Thomas's instruments went wild with readings that defied explanation, detecting electromagnetic fields that pulsed in rhythm with something deep underground. "This pattern is consistent across multiple sites," Thomas noted, his scientific mind struggling to process phenomena that challenged everything he thought he knew about physics. "The energy flows like water through underground rivers, but it's not following geological formations. It's as if something or someone deliberately carved channels through solid rock to direct these forces." At the second site they discovered obsidian arrowheads identical to the one Angus carried, buried in soil that showed signs of ancient ceremonial fires. Each weapon glowed faintly when held near Thomas's instruments, as if responding to the electromagnetic fields he was measuring. The obsidian wasn't normal volcanic glass. It contained trace elements that shouldn't exist in earthly materials. "These arrowheads were crafted from meteoric obsidian," Thomas explained after careful examination. "The mineral composition includes isotopes that can only form in the vacuum of space. Whoever made these weapons was working with materials that fell from the heavens, possibly during the same cosmic event that brought whatever is sealed in that cave." The pattern that emerged was both fascinating and terrifying. The disturbances followed natural ley lines that crisscrossed the desert like a vast spider web, connecting sacred sites that had been important to various Native American cultures for thousands of years. But the network was clearly artificial. Someone had modified natural geological formations to create a continental energy distribution system. Ayanna finally agreed to share more of her family's closely guarded secrets, producing items from her personal collection that she had never shown to anyone outside her bloodline. Among these treasures was a ceremonial bone whistle carved from the leg bone of an ancient wolf. Its surface was inscribed with the same shifting symbols that appeared on Angus's obsidian arrowhead, but these symbols moved and changed as they watched, rearranging themselves in patterns that hurt the mind to follow. This was used to call the spirit wolves during the last binding ceremony, she explained, her voice heavy with the weight of generations of responsibility. My grandfather said the wolves were not ordinary animals, but guardians from the spirit world, sent to help maintain the barriers between light and darkness. When the binding weakens, the spirit wolves answer the call, but they can only manifest through bloodlines that carry the ancient connection. When Ayana demonstrated the whistle's power, blowing a single haunting note across the desert, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Wolves howled from every direction, their voices creating a harmony that seemed to resonate through the earth itself. The sound built in layers, first the normal wolves responding to what they heard, then something else, deeper and more powerful, as if the land itself was adding its voice to the call. Kanti's entire body trembled at the sound, his amber eyes rolling back to show only white for several terrifying moments. When his vision returned, those eyes glowed with the same light that emanated from the distant cave. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Something ancient had awakened within the wolf, responding to the spirit call that had echoed across the desert. Thomas's scientific instruments went haywire during the demonstration, their readings spiking to levels that should have been impossible. Gauges pegged at maximum values, coils sparked with overloaded energy, and several devices simply shut down as their circuits were overwhelmed by forces they weren't designed to measure. Whatever energy you just tapped into operates on frequencies that our current understanding of physics can't explain, he said, staring at his smoking equipment in amazement. The electromagnetic pulse generated by that whistle registered across every spectrum my instruments can detect, and probably several they can't. The combination of ancient wisdom and modern technology began to reveal the true scope of their situation. The cave wasn't just a single location, but the central hub of a vast network of spiritual and geological forces that had been carefully balanced for centuries. The binding ritual hadn't simply locked away an evil entity. It had created a complex system of checks and balances that maintained harmony between the physical and spiritual worlds. Thomas's electromagnetic readings grew more alarming each day, showing energy patterns that defied conventional scientific understanding. His instruments detected what could only be described as tears in the fabric of reality itself, points where the normal laws of physics seemed to break down entirely. The most intense readings came from directly beneath the Forbidden's cave, where something massive was stirring in chambers that his equipment suggested extended deep into the Earth's core. According to my calculations, Thomas explained to the assembled group, his voice tight with scientific wonder and growing fear, the underground cavern system is vast, potentially spanning hundreds of miles beneath the desert. The energy signatures suggest multiple levels, with the deepest chambers showing readings that are completely off the charts. Whatever's down there is operating on a scale that dwarfs anything we've encountered, his instruments had revealed. A three-dimensional network of chambers and tunnels that form geometric patterns too precise to be natural. The entire system appeared to be designed as a massive resonance chamber, capable of amplifying and focusing electromagnetic energy in ways that current science couldn't explain. Most disturbing of all, the readings showed that this ancient machine was slowly coming back to life after centuries of dormancy. More artifacts began surfacing around the area with each passing day, as if the increasing supernatural activity was loosening the Earth's grip on objects that had been buried for centuries. Angus and Kanti discovered carved stone markers that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Ancient pottery vessels still contained dried herbs that released otherworldly fragrances when disturbed, and weapons crafted from materials that seemed to absorb and reflect the light in impossible ways. Each discovery added another piece to the puzzle of what their ancestors had faced. The artifacts weren't random. They formed a deliberate pattern around the cave site, creating what Ayana recognized as protective wards that had been placed by multiple generations of shamans. But these wards were failing, their power sources depleted after centuries of continuous operation. Kanti's transformation became more pronounced during this period, changes that went far beyond anything Angus had thought possible. The wolf's senses had expanded beyond normal animal capabilities. Kanti could detect the approach of shadow creatures hours before they became visible, could sense changes in the spiritual atmosphere like a living barometer of supernatural activity. His amber eyes had begun to glow faintly, even in daylight, reflecting an inner fire that seemed to burn brighter with each passing day. Most remarkably, the wolf had begun to exhibit precognitive abilities that saved their lives on multiple occasions. Kanti would suddenly change direction during their explorations, leading Angus away from paths that appeared safe but concealed deadly spiritual traps. The wolf seemed to perceive threats that existed in potential rather than reality, as if he could see multiple possible futures and choose the safest path through them. On the third day of their expanded investigation, multiple tribal members reported seeing shadowy figures in broad daylight. Unlike the brief glimpses they had experienced before, these sightings lasted long enough for detailed observation. That shadow creatures appeared to be scouting the settlement, testing the boundaries of the tribal territory like predators, evaluating potential prey for weaknesses they could exploit. The descriptions from different witnesses were remarkably consistent. The shadows moved with intelligence and purpose, communicating with each other through gestures that suggested a complex social structure. They appeared most frequently near water sources and sacred sites, as if drawn to places where spiritual energy naturally concentrated. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to be learning from their observations, adapting their behavior based on the human's reactions. Ayana decided that the time had come for a purification ceremony using sacred sage that only grew near spiritual vortexes. She had been saving this precious bundle for a crisis exactly like this one herbs that had been blessed by 7 generations of medicine women and infused with protective power that accumulated over decades of ritual use. The sage came from plants that grew only in places where the spirit world touched the physical realm, making them incredibly potent but also dangerous to harvest. The purification ceremony took place at dawn, with all willing tribal members forming a protective circle around the settlement. The ritual followed ancient protocols that had been passed down through oral tradition, each gesture and word precisely calibrated to channel spiritual energy in specific ways. Ayana lit the sacred sage bundle with fire kindled from friction, in the ancient way, refusing to use any modern implements that might contaminate the ceremony's purity. The smoke that arose was unlike anything they had ever seen. Instead of the normal gray-white color, this smoke glowed with a soft golden light and moved against the wind, flowing deliberately toward areas where the shadow creatures had been spotted. The luminous smoke seemed to possess its own intelligence, seeking out spiritual contamination and neutralizing it with gentle but implacable force. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The oppressive atmosphere that had been building for days lifted noticeably, and the supernatural pressure that had been making everyone's nerves raw suddenly eased. Animals that had been hiding emerged from their shelters. Birds resumed their normal songs, and even the desert wind seemed to blow more freely. More importantly, the ceremony seemed to weaken the cave's malevolent influence temporarily, allowing the group to approach much closer to the forbidden site than had been possible before. The spiritual barriers that had prevented investigation were still present, but significantly reduced, creating a window of opportunity that might not come again. For the first time, they could examine the cave entrance directly without being overwhelmed by the spiritual forces emanating from it. The opening was larger than it had appeared from a distance, a natural cathedral carved into the red sandstone cliff face by forces that operated on geological timescales. Ancient symbols covered the rock surfaces around the entrance, painted in pigments that still glowed with supernatural light after centuries of exposure to the harsh desert environment. Thomas's instruments detected a second entrance to the cave system, partially collapsed and hidden behind fallen boulders about a quarter-mile from the main opening. This secondary entrance appeared to be artificial, clearly excavated by human hands rather than formed by natural geological processes. The electromagnetic readings suggested that this was actually the original entrance, deliberately sealed by whoever had created the binding ritual. Working together, they cleared enough debris to peer into the collapsed tunnel. Their torchlight revealed carved walls depicting scenes of epic battles between figures of light and shadow, artwork so sophisticated that it challenged everything historians thought they knew about ancient southwestern cultures. The images told a story of cosmic conflict that spanned ages, showing the same struggle being fought across multiple civilizations and time periods. As they explored the outer areas of the accessible cave system, they discovered evidence of multiple occupations spanning thousands of years. Different layers of artifacts suggested that various Native American cultures had used these caves for ceremonial purposes, each adding their own protections and warnings to those left by their predecessors. The cumulative effect was a spiritual fortress built up over millennia, with each generation contributing to a defense system designed to contain something that threatened all existence. During their investigation of the cave paintings, Angus experienced his first direct spiritual contact through the obsidian arrowhead. While examining a particularly complex series of images that seemed to move and shift when viewed peripherally, the artifact grew warm in his hand and suddenly his consciousness was pulled into a vision of the past more vivid than any dream. The discovery that changed everything came when they finally cleared enough debris from the collapsed secondary entrance to venture inside. Hidden within the rubble, Thomas found an ancient stone tablet that had been deliberately placed to block the passage. The tablet was massive, nearly 6 feet tall, and covered with warnings written in multiple languages, some recognizable as ancient Apache dialects, others in scripts that predated any known writing system in North America. The tablet's surface was carved with intricate detail that spoke of master craftsmen working with tools and techniques lost to time. Symbols flowed across the stone in spiraling patterns that seemed to move when viewed directly, creating an optical illusion that made the eye water and the mind struggle to focus. Between the symbolic warnings were pictographs that told a story of cosmic horror spanning millennia. Thomas worked feverishly to translate the readable portions, while Ayana interpreted the symbolic elements that conveyed meaning beyond words. What emerged was a chilling account of the entity imprisoned within the cave system. It wasn't merely a malevolent spirit or demon from tribal mythology. It was something far more dangerous, a force that existed on a cosmic scale beyond human comprehension. According to this, Thomas said, his voice tight with concern as he struggled to find words for concepts that human language wasn't designed to express. The entity feeds on life force and order itself, converting everything it touches into emptiness and chaos. The ancient shamans didn't just imprison it. They created a network of spiritual barriers designed to contain its influence across the entire continental landmass. The tablet described the entity as a voidbringer, a cosmic force of entropy that existed to unmake creation itself. It had arrived from spaces between the stars, drawn to Earth by the planet's abundant life energy. The ancient civilizations that first encountered it had watched entire regions simply cease to exist, not destroyed but erased from reality as if they had never been. Kanti's behavior became increasingly protective as they delved deeper into the cave's secrets, changes that went beyond normal animal instincts into something approaching supernatural awareness. The wolf seemed to sense approaching danger long before the humans became aware of it, positioning himself between Angus and potential threats with an alertness that bordered on precognition. His amber eyes had begun to glow faintly incomplete. Darkness, reflecting light that wasn't there and seeing things that remained invisible to human perception. The weather patterns around the cave grew more erratic and unnatural with each passing day. Winds arose from no apparent source, carrying temperatures that fluctuated wildly from scorching heat to bitter cold within moments. The sky above the cave often showed different weather than the surrounding area, sometimes clear and bright while storms raged just miles away. Other times dark with supernatural clouds, while the rest of the desert basked in brilliant sunlight. These atmospheric disturbances weren't random, but followed patterns that suggested intelligent manipulation. The entity was testing its prison from within, probing for weaknesses in the spiritual barriers that contained it. Each supernatural storm was an attempt to weaken the binding by disrupting the natural energy flows that powered the ancient protective systems. Ayana finally revealed the complete story her grandfather had shared with her before his death, secrets that had been guarded by their bloodline for generations. He had been one of 7 shamans chosen to maintain the binding after the original creators had sacrificed themselves to establish it. The responsibility had been passed down through specific families, with each generation producing individuals capable of perceiving and manipulating the spiritual forces involved. My grandfather's grandfather was there when they first bound. The Voidbringer, she explained, her voice heavy with the weight of ancestral memory. He told stories of how the creature had already consumed 3 entire tribes before they managed to trap it. Whole settlements simply vanished overnight, leaving nothing behind but empty circles of dead earth where life could never grow again. The binding process had required sacrifice on an unimaginable scale. Hundreds of shamans from dozens of tribes had given their lives to create the initial prison, their combined life force forming the spiritual chains that held the entity. The survivors had established a system of hereditary guardians, families whose bloodlines carried the ability to sense disturbances in the binding and perform the necessary maintenance rituals. The obsidian arrowhead in Angus's possession had begun showing him visions more frequently, each one revealing another aspect of the ancient struggle. Through these supernatural glimpses into the past, he saw the original shamans working for months to create the spiritual prison, drawing power from ley lines that crisscrossed the continent like a vast network of supernatural arteries. The visions showed him that the binding hadn't been a single act, but an ongoing process that required constant maintenance and renewal. The shamans had created a system designed to last for millennia, but they had also known that their descendants would eventually need to strengthen or replace the barriers as they aged and weakened over time. Most disturbing of all, the visions revealed that the current crisis was part of a cycle that repeated every few centuries. The Voidbringer was patient beyond human understanding, testing its prison methodically and learning from each attempt. Sometimes, the Guardians succeeded in reinforcing the binding, buying centuries of safety. Other times they failed, and the entity managed to extend its influence before being contained again. Thomas made contact with other archaeological teams, working at ancient sites across the Southwest, and their reports painted a terrifying picture of coordinated supernatural disturbances. Similar phenomena were occurring at sacred locations throughout Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and parts of Utah, all connected by the same electromagnetic ley lines his instruments had detected. "We're not dealing with an isolated incident," Thomas reported grimly to the assembled tribal council. "This is a coordinated assault on the entire network of spiritual barriers. The Voidbringer has been systematically weakening secondary sites for decades, concentrating pressure on the primary binding here. If the main prison fails, the secondary sites won't be able to contain the cascade effect." Other Native American tribes began reporting their own encounters with shadow creatures and supernatural disturbances through a network of runners who carried messages between distant settlements. The stories were remarkably consistent failed. Crops in circular patterns, animals found dead without any signs of injury, and people who had simply walked into the wilderness and never returned, leaving no trace of their passage. The tribal council expanded to include representatives from neighboring communities, creating an unprecedented alliance between groups that had often been rivals in the past. The gravity of the situation transcended traditional territorial boundaries. Everyone understood that they were facing a threat that could destroy all their ways of life if not contained. Kanti detected the presence of something alive deeper in the cave system, something that pulsed with malevolent intelligence unlike anything in the natural world. The wolf's reaction was profound, a combination of fear, rage, and protective instinct that made his entire body tremble with barely contained energy. When they approached the areas where Kanti sensed this presence, the temperature dropped noticeably and their breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. The entity was stirring, responding to their investigations with increasing awareness and hostility, preparing for a confrontation that would determine the fate of existence itself. The preparation for their descent into the cave system required combining spiritual precautions with practical planning on a scale none of them had imagined possible. Ayana spent days creating protective amulets for each member of their small expedition team, using herbs and stones that had been blessed through generations of ceremony. Each amulet was unique, crafted specifically for its intended wearer using materials that resonated with their individual spiritual signature. The process was exhausting and dangerous. Many of the required herbs could only be gathered during specific phases of the moon, and some of the protective stones had to be charged with energy drawn from sacred sites scattered across hundreds of miles of desert. Ayana aged visibly during this period, the strain of channeling so much spiritual power taking a toll on her physical form that might never fully heal. Thomas contributed scientific equipment modified to function in high electromagnetic environments, though he warned that much of it would likely fail once they reached the deeper chambers. His instruments had been detecting increasing instability in the cave's energy patterns, suggesting that the Voidbringer was actively working to disrupt any technology that might be used against it. "The entity is learning," Thomas explained as he calibrated his equipment for the final time. "Every probe we send into the cave, every measurement we take, provides it with information about our capabilities. We're in an intelligence competition with something that has had centuries to study the problem while we're trying to understand it in a matter of days." Kanti's transformation accelerated dramatically as they prepared for the journey into the depths. The wolf's amber eyes now glowed visibly, even in daylight, and his size seemed to have increased noticeably over the past week. Most remarkably, Kanti had begun to understand complex human speech in ways that went far beyond normal animal intelligence, responding to detailed instructions and even seeming to anticipate their needs before they were voiced. "He's becoming something more than a wolf," Ayana observed, watching Kanti study the crystal map with obvious comprehension. "The spiritual energy awakening in this place is transforming him into what his bloodline was always meant to be. A bridge between the physical and spirit worlds." The transformation wasn't without its dangers. Kanti sometimes seemed to exist partially in other dimensions, his form becoming translucent as he flickered between realities. During these episodes, he would respond to threats and stimuli that were invisible to human perception, fighting battles in spiritual realms that left him exhausted and disoriented when he returned to normal awareness. Despite the obvious risks to the wolf, Kanti made it clear through his behavior that he would not be left behind. When Angus attempted to secure him safely away from the cave entrance, the wolf became agitated to the point of illness, pacing frantically and howling with a sound that made every tribal member's heart ache with sympathetic pain. It became obvious that Kanti's presence wasn't just helpful. It was essential to their mission in ways they didn't yet understand. The cave's outer chambers revealed evidence of multiple civilizations that had used the site over thousands of years, each leaving their own layer of protections and warnings like archaeological strata of spiritual warfare. The accumulated wisdom of dozens of generations had gone into maintaining the prison, with each group adding their own innovations to the binding spell. Some civilizations had contributed architectural elements, carved pillars, and chambers designed to channel energy in specific patterns. Others had left behind ritual objects and ceremonial tools that still hummed with accumulated power after centuries of disuse. Most had contributed their knowledge, recording their understanding of the Voidbringer's nature in symbols and artwork that covered every available surface. The crystal formation that served as their map responded to the obsidian arrowhead's presence, projecting detailed three-dimensional images of the path they would need to follow. The route to the binding chamber was treacherous, winding through passages that had been deliberately designed to confuse and discourage intruders. Ancient traps, both physical and spiritual, protected the way forward. The map revealed that the cave system was far more complex than even Thomas's instruments had suggested. Chambers existed on dozens of different levels, connected by a maze of tunnels that formed geometric patterns visible only when viewed from above. The entire structure was designed as a massive three-dimensional mandala, a spiritual machine designed to focus and amplify the binding energies. Thomas's equipment detected massive electromagnetic disturbances building in the deepest parts of the cave system. His readings suggested that something was actively working to destabilize the spiritual barriers from within, using knowledge of the binding's weak points that could only have come from centuries of patient observation and testing. The team discovered preserved artifacts suggesting that previous attempts had been made to reinforce the binding over the centuries. Some expeditions had succeeded, temporarily strengthening the barriers and buying time for future generations. Others had failed catastrophically, leaving behind evidence of battles fought in the deep chambers where the survivors had been forced to retreat and seal passages behind them. Strange acoustics in the chambers amplified whispers and spiritual voices from the past. As they moved deeper into the cave system, they could hear echoes of ancient ceremonies, the chants of long-dead shamans, and sometimes the terrifying sounds of the Voidbringer testing its bonds. The very walls seemed to preserve memories of the cosmic struggle being waged in the depths. The sounds weren't random, but followed patterns that suggested they were hearing actual recordings of past events, somehow preserved in the quantum structure of the cave walls. Ayana could identify specific chants and ceremonies from her own tradition, performed by shamans who had died generations before she was born. The cave was a repository of spiritual history, preserving the accumulated knowledge of everyone who had ever contributed to the binding. Kanti's supernatural senses detected the presence of something massive and malevolent far below them, something that pulsed with hunger and rage that had been building for centuries. The wolf's reaction to this presence was profound. His entire body would tense and his hackles would rise, but he never showed any inclination to retreat. Instead, his protective instincts intensified, as if he recognized an ancient enemy that had to be faced regardless of the personal cost. The obsidian arrowhead began showing Angus visions of the entity's true nature during quiet moments when his guard was down. The Voidbringer wasn't simply destructive, it was actively opposed to existence itself. Its touch didn't just kill or corrupt. It unmade things on a fundamental level, reducing matter and energy back to the primordial nothingness from which they had emerged. The entity represented entropy, given consciousness and purpose, a cosmic force that sought to return the universe to its original state of perfect emptiness. It wasn't evil in any human sense. It was something far more alien and terrifying, operating according to principles that predated the concepts of good and evil by billions of years. Other tribal members began experiencing strange dreams and visions as the spiritual disturbances intensified. These weren't random nightmares, but coordinated attacks on their minds, attempts by the Voidbringer to plant fear and doubt that would weaken their resolve when the final confrontation came. The entity was preparing for battle on multiple fronts, using every weapon at its disposal to ensure its eventual freedom. The revelation came when they finally reached the binding chamber, deep beneath the desert floor in a cathedral-sized cavern that took their breath away with its impossible grandeur. At its center stood a circle of 12 ancient stones, each one carved with symbols that pulsed with dying lights like the last embers of a cosmic fire. But what shocked them wasn't the grandeur of the chamber. It was the figure standing guard within the circle. The guardian spirit wasn't the malevolent entity they had expected to find. Instead, it was a being of pure light, humanoid in shape, but composed of radiant energy that hurt to look at directly. Its form flickered and wavered like a candle flame in the wind, clearly weakened after centuries of constant vigilance, but still maintaining its eternal watch. When it turned toward them, its voice resonated not through the air, but directly in their minds, speaking in harmonies that bypassed human language entirely. "Finally," the guardian whispered, its mental voice filled with exhaustion and hope that spanned centuries of solitude. "I had begun to fear that no one would come, that the bloodlines had been broken and the knowledge lost forever." Angus felt the obsidian arrowhead burn in his hand as the truth flooded into his consciousness like water through a broken dam. The guardian spirit had been standing watch over this chamber for over 800 years, maintaining a spiritual barrier that kept something far worse than itself contained. The entity imprisoned here wasn't the guardian. It was what the Paldi guardian was protecting the world from. "The shadow creatures," Thomas said, his scientific mind struggling to process what his instruments were detecting. Energy readings that defied every law of physics he thought he understood. "They're not servants of whatever's in here. They're trying to break in from the outside." The Guardian's form solidified slightly as it focused its remaining energy on communication, revealing features that were neither male nor female, but somehow encompassed both and neither. Through the obsidian arrowhead's quantum connection, it shared the true history of the binding chamber, downloading centuries of accumulated knowledge directly into Angus's consciousness. The revelation was staggering in its implications. Centuries ago, an entity of pure void had emerged from spaces between the stars, not evil in any human sense, but something so fundamentally opposed to existence that its very presence began unmaking reality on a quantum level. It didn't destroy things in the conventional sense. It simply caused them to cease existing, as if they had never been in the first place. Ancient shamans from dozens of tribes had worked together to trap the Voidbringer, but they hadn't been strong enough to destroy something that existed outside the normal concepts of life and death. Instead, they had created this spiritual prison, powered by the life force of willing volunteers and maintained by guardian spirits, who took on the terrible burden of eternal vigilance. "The entity you call the Voidbringer is patient beyond human understanding," the guardian explained, its mental voice carrying echoes of cosmic loneliness. "It has existed since before your universe began its expansion, and it will exist long after the last star burns out. To it, the few billion years of your planet's existence are merely moments, and it can wait eons for the perfect opportunity to escape." The guardian addressing them was the last of its kind, the sole survivor of a host of protective entities that had once shared this duty. Its companions had sacrificed themselves one by one over the centuries, giving their essence to strengthen the binding whenever the Voidbringer's influence grew too strong. Now only one remained, and its power was finally beginning to fail. Ayana's grandfather hadn't been killed by the Guardian. He had given his life willingly to strengthen the binding when it showed signs of failing during his lifetime. The stories of his death had been changed over the generations to discourage others from approaching the cave. But the truth was that he had sacrificed himself heroically to buy time for future generations. "Your ancestor understood what was at stake," the Guardian revealed, projecting images directly into their minds of the night Ayana's grandfather had made his final journey to the cave. "He came here knowing he would not return. carrying with him the accumulated spiritual power of his bloodline. His sacrifice bought us another 50 years of stability, but that time has now passed. The binding circle they saw was not a prison in the conventional sense, but a lock of unimaginable complexity, and the guardian spirit was the key that kept it closed. But the lock was failing after centuries of constant use, its spiritual mechanisms wearing down under the relentless pressure of containing something that existed to unmake existence itself. The Voidbringer grows stronger as chaos spreads throughout your world, the Guardian explained, gesturing toward the 12 stones with a hand made of condensed starlight. Wars, hatred, destruction, all of these feed the entity and weaken the barriers that contain it. Your species' capacity for conflict has accelerated the deterioration of the binding far beyond what the original creators anticipated. Thomas's instruments revealed the shocking truth about the archaeological disturbances they had detected across the region. The other sites weren't separate problems. They were secondary locks in a vast network of spiritual barriers that spanned the entire continent. As each one failed, more pressure was placed on the primary binding chamber, creating a cascade effect that threatened to overwhelm even the Guardian's power. The shadow creatures they had been fighting weren't emanating from the cave. They were being drawn to it from across the spiritual realm, desperate to prevent the Voidbringer's escape just as much as the humans were. These dark spirits were actually guardians from failed binding sites, weakened and corrupted by their long exposure to the Voidbringer's influence, but still fighting to maintain their protected duty. Kanti's reaction to this revelation was profound. The Wolf approached the guardian spirit without fear, and when the being of light touched him, Kanti's entire form blazed with supernatural radiance. The truth of the Wolf's heritage became clear. He was descended from the spirit animals that had helped create the original binding, and his bloodline carried the genetic memory of their sacred duty. Your companion is not merely a wolf, the Guardian revealed, its voice filled with recognition and respect. His ancestors gave their life force to create the binding, and their sacrifice flows in his blood. He has been drawn here because the time has come for that bloodline to fulfill its purpose once again. The obsidian arrowhead in Angus's possession was revealed to be one of 12 keys needed to operate the binding circle. Each arrowhead had been crafted from stone that fell from the heavens during the Voidbringer's arrival, infused with cosmic energies that could reinforce the spiritual barriers. Over the centuries, most of the keys have been lost or destroyed, leaving the binding vulnerable to failure. Ayana produced her medicine pouch and revealed that it contained fragments of 3 additional arrowheads, pieces that her family had guarded for generations without fully understanding their significance. Thomas realized that his archaeological work across the Southwest had actually been guided by subtle spiritual influences. The Guardian had been drawing him to sites where other arrowhead fragments might be found. The true scope of the threat became clear as the Guardian shared its knowledge of the Voidbringer's nature. The entity wasn't simply destructive, it was anti-existence itself, a cosmic force that sought to return the universe to the primordial void from which it had emerged. Its influence spread through negative emotions and destructive actions, growing stronger as civilizations developed more sophisticated ways to cause suffering and chaos. Each war your people fight, each act of cruelty or hatred, feeds the Voidbringer and weakens my ability to contain it, the Guardian explained. It has been patient, allowing your species to grow in numbers and complexity so that when it finally escapes, there will be more existence to unmake. The binding circle began to pulse with erratic light as their presence in the chamber triggered automatic responses in the ancient mechanism. The 12 stones were designed to channel energy from the ley lines that crisscrossed the continent, but several of the connections had been severed over the centuries as human development disrupted the natural energy flows. Thomas discovered that his scientific equipment could actually interface with the binding circle's energy patterns. The ancient shamans had created a system so sophisticated that it could accept input from technologies they had never imagined, suggesting a level of understanding about energy manipulation that modern science was only beginning to approach. The binding was designed to evolve and adapt, the Guardian revealed. Your ancestors knew that future generations would develop new tools and new understanding. They built the prison to accept help from whatever sources became available, whether spiritual or technological. The shadow creatures that had been threatening the settlement weren't trying to attack. They were desperately attempting to reach the binding chamber to offer their own remaining energy to reinforce the failing barriers. Their corrupted appearance was the result of centuries spent in proximity to the Voidbringer's influence, but their essential purpose remained unchanged. As understanding dawned on the assembled group, they realized that everything they had believed about the situation was wrong. The real threat wasn't in the chamber with them. It was the gradual failure of a system that had protected not just their region, but potentially the entire world for 8 centuries. They weren't facing an enemy to be defeated, but a responsibility to be accepted. The Guardian's energy flickered dangerously as it continued to maintain the binding while communicating with them. Time was running out faster than anyone had realized. The Voidbringer could sense the weakness in its prison and was preparing for a final assault that would either free it completely or force the Guardian to exhaust the last of its power in a desperate defensive effort. "You must choose quickly," the Guardian warned, its form growing more translucent with each passing moment. "Either help me restore the binding with whatever power you can provide, or flee while I use the last of my energy to seal this chamber forever. But know that if you choose the second path, the Voidbringer will eventually break free when I am gone, and there will be no one left to stand against it." The weight of 8 centuries of sacrifice and vigilance settled on their shoulders, as they realized that the fate of existence itself now rested in their hands. The decision was made without words, communicated through glances and gestures that carried the weight of generations of responsibility. As the Guardian Spirit's dire warning echoed in their minds, each member of the group felt the mantle of cosmic duty settle upon their shoulders like a burden they had been born to carry. They would not abandon their post as so many others had before them. They would stand and fight, whatever the cost to themselves or their way of life. Ayana immediately began preparing for the renewal ritual, her weathered hands moving with practiced precision that spoke of decades spent mastering the most sacred and dangerous ceremonies of her people. The fragments of obsidian arrowheads, the ceremonial bone whistle, her medicine pouch, and dozens of other artifacts they had gathered were placed in specific patterns around the binding circle according to instructions that seemed to flow directly from the Guardian Spirit into her consciousness. Each item had to be positioned with mathematical precision, their placement following geometric principles that existed at the intersection of ancient wisdom and quantum physics. The pattern they created was a 3-dimensional mandala that would focus and amplify spiritual energy in ways that human minds could barely comprehend. One misplaced artifact could cause the entire ritual to fail catastrophically. Thomas worked frantically to integrate his scientific equipment with the ancient energy systems, his instruments detecting power flows that operated on principles beyond current human understanding. The electromagnetic readings were off the charts, showing energy patterns that seemed to violate basic laws of physics, yet somehow maintain perfect stability within the confines of the binding chamber. The binding circle is essentially a massive electromagnetic resonance chamber, Thomas explained as he adjusted his equipment with trembling hands. It's designed to amplify and focus spiritual energy the same way a laser amplifies light. The ancient shamans created something that operates on quantum levels we're only beginning to understand. His instruments revealed that the binding circle was connected to a vast network of similar devices hidden across the continent, all of them working together to maintain the cosmic balance between existence and entropy. The chamber they stood in was the central hub of this network, the primary control point for a system that spanned thousands of miles and involved hundreds of sacred sites. Kanti underwent the most dramatic transformation of all as the ritual preparations intensified. The wolf's connection to his spiritual heritage became more pronounced with each passing moment, his physical form shifting and changing as ancient bloodlines reasserted themselves after centuries of dormancy. His amber eyes now blazed with the same radiant light that emanated from the guardian spirit, and his size continued to increase until he stood nearly as tall as a horse. The change wasn't merely physical. Kanti's intelligence expanded exponentially, allowing him to understand complex instructions and even contribute to the ritual planning through a form of telepathic communication that bypassed the need for spoken language. He could perceive the flow of spiritual energy through the chamber with perfect clarity, identifying weak points and stress fractures that needed to be addressed. He's becoming what his ancestors were during the original binding, Ayana observed with wonder and deep concern. A spirit wolf, a bridge between the physical and supernatural worlds. But the transformation is dangerous. If we fail, he may be trapped forever in a form that doesn't belong to either realm. The guardian spirit used the last of its reserve energy to share the complete details of what would be required to restore the binding. The ritual was far more complex and dangerous than any of them had imagined, requiring not just the sacrifice of energy, but the willing participation of representatives from all the original binding bloodlines. Fortunately, each member of their group carried the necessary genetic heritage. Angus and Ayana from different Apache lineages, Thomas from his mixed ancestry, and Kanti from the spirit animal bloodlines. But the most crucial component was the creation of a unified sacred fire that would serve as the focal point for channeling energy into the binding circle. This fire had to be kindled using elements from multiple tribal traditions, blessed by representatives of each participating culture, and maintained at precisely the right intensity throughout the entire ceremony. Any deviation from the exact requirements could result in catastrophic failure that would destroy not just them but the entire continental protection network. The sacred fire required materials that had never been combined before: sacred woods from 7 different tribal territories, herbs that only grew during specific phases of the moon, and oils extracted from plants that existed only in places where the spirit world touched the physical realm. Gathering these materials had taken days of dangerous travel across territory, controlled by hostile forces both natural and supernatural. Other tribal members began arriving at the cave entrance. Throughout the day, drawn by spiritual calls they couldn't ignore or resist, runners had spread word of the crisis to neighboring communities across hundreds of miles of desert, and representatives from 6 different tribes made the dangerous journey to offer their assistance. Each group brought sacred artifacts and knowledge that had been preserved in their own traditions, pieces of the larger puzzle that no single culture could have maintained alone. The convergence of so many different tribal traditions in one place created its own form of spiritual energy, a harmony of voices and purposes that strengthened the overall power available for the renewal ceremony. Ancient rivalries and territorial disputes were set aside as everyone recognized the magnitude of the threat they faced together. The shadow spirits that had been threatening the settlement revealed their true nature as the ritual preparations began. They approached the cave entrance not as attackers, but as supplicants, offering the last of their corrupted energy to help power the renewal ceremony. These were the surviving guardians from failed binding sites across the continent, spirits who had maintained their vigil for centuries despite being slowly consumed by the Voidbringer's influence. Ayana performed purification rites that restored some of their original form, revealing them to be the weakened spirits of shamans who had died maintaining other binding sites across the continent. The process was heartbreaking to witness, seeing the faces of teachers and elders who had passed on decades ago, their forms twisted by centuries of exposure to entropic forces, but their essential purpose unchanged. "They've been fighting the Voidbringer for centuries," she explained, tears streaming down her face as she recognized spirits she had known in life. "Some of them are shamans I learned from when I was young, teachers who passed on when I thought they had found peace. Instead, they've been standing guard at failed binding sites, trying to slow the cascade effect that's been building toward this moment." Thomas made a disturbing discovery about the timing of their ritual through analysis of historical records and energy patterns. His calculations showed that the Voidbringer had been manipulating events for decades, subtly influencing human conflicts and disasters to weaken the spiritual barriers at precisely the right moments. World wars, genocides, environmental destruction, all had been orchestrated to feed the entity's power and create the conditions for its escape. "We're not just fighting an imprisoned monster," Thomas realized with growing horror. "We're fighting something that has been actively shaping human history to serve its purposes." The level of intelligence and patience required for such a plan is beyond anything we've encountered. The entity had been playing a game that spanned centuries, moving pieces across a board that encompassed the entire planet. Every major conflict, every technological advancement that disrupted natural energy flows, every act of hatred that generated the negative emotions it fed upon all, had been part of a master plan designed to weaken the binding at exactly the right moment. The binding circle itself began to respond to their preparations, the 12 ancient stones pulsing with increasing brightness as spiritual energy flowed through the ley lines from across the continent. But the readings also showed dangerous instabilities in the system points where centuries of stress had created weaknesses that could cause the entire network to collapse if not addressed during the renewal ritual. Angus felt the weight of his ancestors' expectations as he held the original obsidian arrowhead, its surface now burning with energy that made it almost too hot to touch. Through its connection to the spiritual realm, he could sense the presence of every shaman who had contributed to the original binding, their consciousness somehow preserved within the quantum structure of the cave system. They were counting on him to succeed where they had eventually failed, to create a binding strong enough to last, until humanity developed the wisdom and power to deal with the Voidbringer permanently. The responsibility was crushing, but it was also empowering, connecting him to a legacy of courage and sacrifice that spanned countless generations. The ritual would require each participant to contribute a portion of their life force to power the renewed binding, following the example of the ancient shamans who had given their lives willingly for this purpose. But the current situation was different. The renewal could potentially be accomplished without fatal cost if they could successfully integrate spiritual and technological approaches in ways the original creators had never imagined possible. The binding ritual began at the moment when the sacred fire reached its peak intensity, flames burning with colors that had no names in human language, deep purples that spoke of cosmic depths, golds that carried the essence of starlight, and blues so profound they seemed to contain entire galaxies. Ayana led the opening chants in the ancient tongue, while Thomas monitored the energy flows through his instruments. The 12 binding stones responded immediately, their surfaces blazing with accumulated power from ley lines that stretched across the continent. Like a vast nervous system of spiritual energy, Angus felt the obsidian arrowhead burn in his hands. As spiritual energy flowed through it into the binding circle, the weapon transforming before his eyes from simple volcanic glass into something that existed partially in multiple dimensions. Its surface became translucent and filled with swirling galaxies of light, each one representing a different aspect of cosmic creation that the Voidbringer sought to unmake. Through its connection to the quantum realm, he could sense the entity stirring in its prison, aware that its captors were attempting to strengthen the barriers that contained it. The Voidbringer's response was immediate and overwhelming. A wave of pure entropy that struck the binding circle with force that made the entire mountain tremble. Dark energy erupted from the deepest chambers of the cave system, seeking to disrupt the ritual before it could gain momentum. The attack came in multiple forms: physical vibrations that threatened to shatter the ancient stones, electromagnetic pulses that tried to overload Thomas's equipment, and spiritual assaults that attempted to break the concentration of the human participants. The shadow spirits outside the cave formed a protective barrier, their corrupted forms blazing with the last of their power as they fought to hold back the waves of destructive force. These forgotten guardians, twisted by centuries of exposure to entropic influence, threw themselves against the Voidbringer's attacks with desperate courage. One by one, they sacrificed themselves to buy precious moments for the renewal ritual to continue. Kanti revealed his full spirit wolf nature as the battle intensified, his form expanding until he stood 12 feet tall, composed of pure spiritual energy that blazed like a newborn star. The transformation was magnificent and terrible. He was no longer the wolf Angus had raised, but something far older and more powerful, a guardian spirit that had taken physical form to fight in this final battle against cosmic darkness. The blood of my ancestors flows through these stones. Kanti's voice resonated directly in their minds, bypassing human language to communicate in harmonies of pure meaning. I am the last of the spirit wolves, and I will not fail in my duty as they have never failed in theirs. The guardian spirit began to glow brighter as energy flowed into it from multiple sources: the sacred fire, the binding stones, the sacrificing shadow spirits, and the willing participants all contributed their power to restore the weakened entity to its full strength. For the first time in centuries, the guardian stood tall and radiant, its form solid and unwavering as it prepared to channel the enormous energies required for the binding's renewal. Thomas's equipment detected massive energy surges building throughout the cave system as the Voidbringer launched its counterattack with increasing desperation. The entity had spent centuries analyzing the binding structure, and now it struck with surgical precision at the weakest points in the spiritual barriers. Cracks appeared in several of the binding stones, spreading like spider webs as dark energy sought to shatter the prison from within. The battle between light and darkness raged on levels that human senses could barely perceive, spiritual forces clashing in dimensions beyond physical space, where the laws of physics held no meaning. The renewed guardian spirit led the defense against an entity that represented the antithesis of existence itself, their conflict creating shock waves that rippled across the quantum structure of reality. The very air in the chamber crackled with competing energies as reality itself became the battlefield. Matter and antimatter swirled in impossible configurations. Time flowed backward in localized pockets, and gravity shifted direction as the fundamental forces of the universe were caught up in the cosmic struggle between creation and entropy. YAN, a single quotes S. Chanting reached a crescendo as she channeled power through the ceremonial bone whistle, its haunting notes resonating through the quantum structure of the binding circle. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a harmony that strengthened the spiritual barriers while causing the Voidbringer's attacks to lose coherence and focus. Each note carried the accumulated spiritual power of generations of shamans who had prepared for this moment. One of the binding stones cracked completely under the assault, its stored energy dissipating in a burst of light that temporarily blinded everyone in the chamber. The failure sent shock waves through the entire continental network, causing secondary binding sites hundreds of miles away to flicker and weaken. They were running out of time. If too many stones failed, the cascade effect would become unstoppable, and the Voidbringer would break free regardless of their efforts. The chamber filled with the sound of cosmic forces in conflict harmonies that spoke of creation's struggle against entropy. melodies that carried the hopes and fears of every living thing that had ever existed. The battle had moved beyond the physical realm into dimensions where thought and emotion became weapons in their own right. Angus made a desperate decision as another binding stone began to fracture under the Voidbringer's relentless assault. Drawing on everything he had learned about spiritual warfare from the obsidian arrowhead's visions, he stepped directly into the binding circle center, placing himself at the focal point of energy so intense that his physical form began to blur and shift between dimensions. The forces there were beyond anything mortal flesh was meant to endure, but the arrowhead's protection and his own spiritual strength allowed him to become a living conduit for the renewal power. I stand for all who came before and all who will come after, he declared, his voice somehow audible above the cosmic storm raging around them. The void will not pass while courage remains in the hearts of the living. The Voidbringer focused its attention on Angus with malevolent intelligence that spanned eons, recognizing him as the key to the human's resistance. Dark energy struck him with force that would have annihilated ordinary matter, waves of pure entropy that sought to unmake him on a molecular level. But the obsidian arrowhead's protection and his own spiritual fortitude allowed him to endure, transforming him into a lighthouse of human determination in the midst of entropic chaos. Kanti and the guardian spirit fought side by side against manifestations of pure negation that sought to unmake the binding circle stone by stone. These weren't creatures in any recognizable sense, but abstract concepts given form-living embodiments of dissolution, decay, and the final heat death of the universe. Their combined radiance pushed back the darkness, but the effort was consuming both of them rapidly as they channeled more power than any single entity was meant to contain. Dr. Spirit Wolf's magnificent form flickered as he drew upon reserves of energy that came from his very essence, each defensive action costing him a portion of his existence. Yet he continued to fight with unwavering determination, understanding that this battle would determine whether existence itself had meaning or would be reduced to primordial nothingness. The sacred fire blazed higher, fed by the sacrifice of the shadow spirits who cast themselves into its flames to fuel the renewal ritual. Each spirit that gave its remaining essence to the fire strengthened the binding by a crucial margin, their centuries of faithful service finally finding its ultimate purpose. The flames consumed their corrupted forms and transformed their sacrifice into pure spiritual energy that flowed into the binding stones. Thomas realized that the binding stones needed to be recalibrated to handle the massive energy flows that were threatening to overwhelm their ancient crystalline structure. Working frantically with his instruments while spiritual warfare raged around him, he began adjusting the quantum resonance frequencies that regulated power distribution throughout the circle. His equipment sparked and overloaded as it interfaced with forces that existed beyond the normal electromagnetic spectrum. The Voidbringer's final assault began as it gathered every fragment of dark energy and had accumulated over 8 centuries of imprisonment, preparing to shatter its prison once and for all in a single overwhelming attack. The entity's patience had finally reached its limit. It would either break free now or exhaust itself in the attempt, leaving it vulnerable to a renewed binding that might last for millennia. The deepest chamber of the cave system called to Angus. Through the obsidian arrowhead's connection to the quantum realm, its voice cutting through the chaos with crystalline clarity. Far below their current position lay the heart of the prisoner, place where the Voidbringer's essence was most concentrated and where the binding could be permanently sealed with the right combination of sacrifice and determination. But reaching it would require passing through layers of pure entropic energy that would challenge the very existence of anyone who attempted the journey. The path led through dimensions where matter and energy lost their meaning, where consciousness itself could be dissolved if one's will faltered for even a moment. "I have to reach the core chamber," Angus announced, his voice carrying absolute conviction despite the cosmic forces trying to tear him apart. The eternal seal stone is there, the final component needed to lock the binding permanently. Kanti's spirit wolf form blazed brighter as he positioned himself to clear a path through the Voidbringer's defenses, his supernatural senses able to perceive safe routes through the chaotic energy matrix. The magnificent creature had transcended his physical origins completely, becoming a force of nature, dedicated to protecting the balance between existence and nothingness. His amber eyes, now burning like twin suns, met Angus's with understanding. That needed no words. The wolf would hold the upper levels, while Angus descended to complete the binding, each of them accepting their role in a cosmic drama that had been building for centuries. "I will clear the way," Kanti's mental voice carried, the weight of absolute determination. "But you must hurry. Even my strength cannot hold back the void indefinitely." The guardian spirit gathered the last of its accumulated power, preparing to channel 8 centuries of stored energy into one final defensive action that would either save existence or consume itself in the attempt. Its form began to burn with radiance that made the chamber's walls transparent, revealing the vast network of spiritual machinery that extended throughout the mountain. The descent into the core chamber was a journey through layers of cosmic horror that tested every aspect of Angus's being, physical, mental, and spiritual. The obsidian arrowhead had transformed into a weapon of pure spiritual energy, its light the only thing preventing him from being dissolved by the concentrated void energy that filled the deepest passages. Each step forward required tremendous willpower as the entity's influence tried to convince him that existence itself was meaningless. That entropy was the natural state of the universe, and all efforts to preserve life were futile gestures against the inevitable dot in the core chamber. Angus came face to face with the Voidbringer's true form, a paradox of cosmic proportions that was simultaneously massive and microscopic, ancient beyond measure yet existing outside the normal flow of time. It spoke to him in languages that predated matter itself, offering him ultimate knowledge and power in exchange for abandoning his mission. The temptation was almost overwhelming. The promise of understanding the universe's deepest secrets, of transcending mortal limitations and becoming something beyond human comprehension. But Angus remembered the faces of his people, the sacrifices of countless generations who had died to maintain the binding, and the trust that Kanti had placed in him through their years together. The Voidbringer's offers meant nothing compared to the responsibility he carried for protecting the future of all existence. The eternal seal stone lay at the chamber's center, a crystalline formation that pulsed with concentrated starlight and contained the compressed essence of the first shamans who had created the binding. It had been waiting for 8 centuries for someone worthy to activate it, someone willing to channel their own life energy into its quantum structure and create a lock that could never be broken. As Angus grasped the seal stone, visions flooded, his mind showing the complete history of the cosmic struggle, the Voidbringer's arrival from spaces between galaxies, the desperate war fought by civilizations across the universe to contain its influence, and the terrible cost of each victory. Against the force of entropy, Earth was just one battlefield in a conflict that spanned all of creation. The obsidian arrowhead merged with the seal stone, their combined energies creating a resonance that began to strengthen every binding barrier simultaneously. But the process required more power than Angus possessed alone. It demanded the willing sacrifice of someone whose spiritual strength could bridge the gap between mortal determination and cosmic necessity. Above in the main chamber, Kanti sensed what was happening and made his own choice without hesitation. The spirit wolf gathered all of his transformed energy and sent it flowing down through the cave system to where Angus fought his solitary battle. The transfer of power was visible as streams of radiant light that illuminated the deepest passages. But it came at the ultimate cost. Kanti's magnificent form began to fade as he gave everything he was to ensure the sealing would succeed. For family, for all who live. Kanti's final message reached Angus's mind just as the wolf spirit merged with the eternal seal stone, his essence becoming part of the cosmic machinery that would guard against darkness for all eternity. The combined energies of man and wolf, strengthened by 8 centuries of accumulated spiritual power, activated the ultimate binding. The Voidbringer's scream of rage and frustration echoed through dimensions as its prison became permanent and unbreakable. The dark entity was sealed not just for centuries, but for eternity, its influence cut off from the physical universe forever. Eternal Sealstone blazed with the light of newborn stars as the binding reached completion, its radiance visible to spiritual sight across the entire continent as the network of protective barriers was restored to full strength. The cosmic balance had been preserved, existence itself had been saved, and the long vigil of the Guardians was finally complete. The silence that followed the eternal sealing was profound beyond description. After centuries of cosmic warfare, the binding chamber had finally achieved perfect peace. The 12 ancient stones stood whole and unblemished, their surfaces glowing with gentle radiance that spoke of permanent protection rather than desperate struggle. The Voidbringer's influence had been completely severed from the physical realm, its entropic whispers silenced forever. Angus emerged from the core chamber fundamentally changed by his encounter with forces beyond human comprehension. The ordeal had aged him in ways that went beyond physical years, but it had also given him a wisdom and perspective that few mortals ever achieved. He carried within him now the memory of touching the eternal sealstone, of feeling the cosmic balance shift as light triumphed over darkness in the deepest places of existence. The guardian spirit, restored to its full power by the successful renewal ritual, no longer stood alone in its eternal vigil. The binding was now self-sustaining, drawing energy from the planet's magnetic field and the cosmic radiation that bathed the solar system. It would never again require the desperate sacrifices that had maintained it for 8 centuries, though it would still need periodic monitoring by those who understood its nature. Thomas documented everything they had experienced, creating a scientific record that bridged the gap between spiritual wisdom and technological understanding. His instruments had recorded energy patterns that would revolutionize physics if properly interpreted, but he understood that such knowledge needed to be shared carefully and responsibly. Ayana became the new keeper of the binding chamber's history, accepting the responsibility of maintaining accurate records and training future guardians. The tribal council formally recognized her as the primary spiritual authority for the sacred site, ensuring that the ancient traditions would be preserved alongside the new understanding they had gained. The most profound loss was Kanti's transformation from physical companion to spiritual guardian. The wolf's sacrifice had been willing and necessary, but it left an emptiness in Angus's heart that would never completely heal. Yet Kanti wasn't truly gone. His essence had become part of the eternal seal itself, ensuring that the spirit wolf's protective instincts would guard against cosmic darkness for all eternity. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, Angus could sense Kanti's presence in the desert wind or see the reflection of amber eyes in the cave's gentle glow. The wolf had achieved immortality through sacrifice, becoming something greater than either man or animal, a bridge between worlds that would endure as long as existence itself required protection.